Like I said in my first video, when it pertains to the so-called Caucasians, the higher ups know their lineage and they know their origin. They subliminally put it in movies or have these mythos like the abominable snowman, the Sasquatch, or Bigfoot. Movies like Teen Wolf or Harry and the Hendersons. So they do know their history, but they won't tell you this up front. That's why they had to subliminally put it in movies and shows and commercials, apparently. The world that we know is very contrived. The spiritual realm is very real. Things that we've been taught on a base level are based in narratives and half-truths. But people can outright tell you the truth or knowledge of the truth in certain aspects, because a lot of people cannot handle that truth. What do you do with it once you know it? So right here we have an Airbnb commercial. Now, what are they trying to convey to the audience, unbeknownst to the masses of people who don't know history or only know parts of it? But during the medieval times, yes, the Dark Ages, so-called Black people were in rulership. They were the majority of the characters, from King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, 12 knights, and get it, 12 tribes of Israel. Those were our people. But you see over here, where they have artistic license, you can create or fabricate your own history. So what's their history? As I stated in the first part 1 video, who the Caucasians are, I'm going to go more in depth in this video and other videos as well.
If you ever hear that thunder, put your eye to the sky, boy, and wonder. Maybe there's a kingdom above the weather. Oh, and whether you're gonna get on me is up to him. Carry on, world, like some songbird, beautiful stranger. Carry on, world, like some strong bird, beautiful stranger.
So we see the so-called Caucasians' ancestry from the Neanderthal, Wildman, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever people terms that they want to use. So that's what they're conveying to the audience. That this is their origin, this is their story. Also to take in consideration that the modern so-called white person is nothing more than a hybrid, a mixture of, the different mixtures of the Negroid and so forth. So the genes become stronger. So with the modern Caucasian, so-called white person, they have a mixture of Negro strands in their genetic structure from our genes, which is the dominant gene. This is scientifically speaking, right? Because we know Caucasians have recessive genes. They cannot produce various shades of color or different multitudes of people. Okay, so they have our genetic structure. That's why they are not as hairy. But then again, you have some Caucasians who have hirsute, which means hairy chest, shaggy all over, bushy, because they still have that Neanderthal. Of course, I think they said it's between 1% to 4% Neanderthal, but They have probably no Negro genetics in them as well. So they retain their ancient ancestors' more genetic sequence. So now we're going to look into the book True Myth, Black Vikings of the Middle Ages. Okay, because one thing with the Eurocentric historians, what they like to do is whitewash the Vikings, the Saxons, the Celts, so forth. In the same old battle we've been fighting, blacks are just from Africa, right? So this is chapter 21, New World Observations. To admit that only a millennium or so ago, numerous black and dark-skinned peoples still resided in Europe will call into question the supposed purity of the white race. Deeply embedded at the root of racist sentiments, the Eurocentric historians and scholars who have promoted these sentiments, on the other hand, never seem to present definite information on the origin of the Caucasians, other than a general consensus that they emerged somewhere in the Caucasus regions of Eurasia, and that they expanded in all directions. How and why they became white is never addressed, other than the oft-stated assertion that living for a millennium in a cold climate with less direct sunlight was responsible. Although many millennia living in the same type of environment somehow did not affect Native Americans or Aboriginals and Inuit peoples, the evidence of the civilization they created in their supposed homeland and where it is to be found is never discussed. Its buried cities, monuments, art, architecture, etc. Eurocentric scholars brazenly attach Caucasians to all the ancient civilizations, from Iberia to the Pacific Islands, contending that they were responsible for the archaic, wondrous, inscrutable works known to have existed in all the lands between them and Ethiopia, Egypt, Sumer, Persia, India, the fabled and extensive territory of Greater Ethiopia. To admit that only a millennium ago the Norsemen of Scandinavia were predominantly black-skinned would call into question the purported preeminence of whites and their supposed eternal presence in Europe. It would mean that black-skinned Europeans were the authors of the feudalistic societies that would become prominent in medieval Europe. Key word, medieval Europe, and prominent, because our people were in rulership during the Dark Ages. Okay, you got to look behind the words. Why are they saying these, Dark Ages, the Black Plague, the bubonic plague, the Renaissance, the rebirth? Okay, this is how they subliminally telling you without telling you, the real history. Demonstrate that blacks were the preeminent mariners of the epoch, the preeminent warriors of the age, who had nearly the whole continent under their dominance. I repeat, who had nearly the whole continent under their dominance. That's why they had to delete the history, give you a fake narrative, 1619, slavery, that Negroes only come from Africa and nowhere else. See, they can't let this type of information come out to the mass. I mean, you got your COVID-19, you got the war that's going on, allegedly, in Ukraine, the first televised war, right? But I ain't going to get on that. But, yeah, the so-called indigenous blacks, we're everywhere. The Americas, we were here first. Europe, there first. Africa, Asia. When you look further back into antiquity or history, you find out that every civilization were black and brown skinned peoples, people of color, copper coated. That's just a universal fact. You may not know anything else, but know that you were here first. You're indigenous. Such an admission would be an admission that black Norsemen were involved in the heraldry and pomp that would be adopted by later European royalty. And they were innovators of the thing, the earliest organized courts to settle legal disputes and trials by peers. a judicial procedure that was duplicated by other Western nations and would lead to the prevailing modern systems of the jurisprudence in Europe and in the Americas. So right here we have chapter 2, the Great White Forest. I'm going to read a couple of highlighted points in this chapter. But we got to remember, the so-called Caucasian is not indigenous to no landmass. However, the people we know as Caucasians or whites evolved. Their numbers were burgeoning during the late Neolithic in the Great White Forest area, from eastern Poland into southern Russia north of the Caucasus Range. Their eastern limit was probably the Ural Mountains, and on the western and eastern fringes of this territory, whites must have eventually had some contact with the towns and trade routes of their black-skinned and now distant relatives, acquiring better tools, weapons, clothing, and other implements from them, which improved the lives of a relatively small number. The great masses of them lived in desperate privation in rude hovels or cave sites where squalor and disease abounded. Key word: rude hovels or cave sites where diseases abounded. Let that sink in for a minute. Their frontal lobes, foreheads, are generally higher, and Caucasian males are more thickly built with generally thicker waistlines, larger calves, ankles, and wrists than blacks and other non-white peoples. They are generally more hirsute, with longer body hair often covering the arms, backs, buttocks, chest, and legs of males, okay? But you see that hirsute with longer body hair. That's how the bubonic plague spread throughout Europe, because of the lice that the so-called Wildman, the Caucasian, had, and they spread throughout Europe. And the black nobility and the citizens did not have any antibodies to fight or combat the diseases that the wild man brought forth and spread throughout Europe. And of course, they conquered and invaded Europe, the British Isles, in 449 or 446 AD. And that's by Professor Boyd Dawkins. So now we're going to jump to page 20. In this highlighted point, it says, in the Iceman and Heritage, author Michael Bradley, writing before DNA technology was developed, referring to Caucasians as Neanderthal Caucasoids, suggests that humans and Neanderthals made it far more extensively than is generally thought. And he unremorsefully decries Caucasian aggression, stating, "It seems reasonable to suppose that we Caucasoids are a identifiable group because of the primitive and bestial, key word, bestial physical characteristics we inherited through Neanderthal genetic input. If the Neanderthals were originally somewhat closer to the apes as a relatively primitive hominoid, it might be justifiable to speculate that our Caucasoid aggression may mirror the apes' lower frustration tolerance." Okay. So when you look at the, Charles Darwin evolution theory chart, you see an ape evolving into a man. Now we know the ape cannot evolve into a man. So we see subliminally they're comparing their characteristics, their actions, their aggressiveness to an ape or a monkey. Now we know historically that they've called our ancestors monkeys, apes, and so forth. And they've made movies to mock us, Planet of the Apes, because they knew we were in rulership in the old world system. So this is the new world order, a false history. Now don't get it twisted. Our ancestors, they did a lot of erroneous things as well. That's why the Most High put the plagues on the black nobility and pretty much destroyed a lot of our people during that time period, because we were very wicked as well, and they know that history. That's why they did it to us. So now we're going to look at the tapestry. This is a tapestry of the Moors versus the Wildman. I'm pretty sure most people have seen this all over the internet because this is nothing new. But this is also in the public domain. But as we see here in the tapestry, we have the Moors versus the Wildman, the so-called Caucasians. And this is dated 1400. We also see the source of this tapestry, which is Charles Potter King Fawn Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. So this is legit. This is not fiction. This is actual history. And they won't teach you this because of the ramifications. Also, you got to consider that the Boule Negroes and the higher ups don't want the masses to know this type of information. They do not want the basic Caucasians and the masses of Caucasians to know this type of information. The ramification it does to their history. And they most definitely do not want the so-called black man to know this type of information. I mean, this is all empowerment to free you from the victimization and to understand your true history, all over this earth. But, a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? So right here we have Negroes in coats and arms. And you can find this in many other pictures online, or J.A. Rogers' Nature Knows No Color Lines. Very detailed and very informative book. But right here we have Exodus 28 and 40, the Net Bible. For Aaron's sons, you are to make tunics, slashes, and keyword headbands for glory and for beauty. And you see these all throughout antiquity, during the medieval, dark ages, middle ages. So you see our ancestors, our peoples, when we were in rulership, castles, kings, queens, knights, pages, squares, esquires, etc. Nobility. Okay? And no wonder why the MDA banned the headband, right? I mean, we put 2 and 2. So now we're at the BBC News, and we have a story on the Black Plague. Black Death spread by humans, not rats. Key word, humans. So we know the bubonic plague was spread by the wild man, or so-called Caucasian. Let's read this article and compare to all the other information that I've read so far in this video about diseases. Rats were not to blame for the spread of plague during the Black Death, according to a study. The rodents and their fleas were thought to have spread a series of outbreaks in 14th through 19th century Europe. But a team from the universities of Oslo and Ferreira now say that the Black Death can be largely ascribed to human fleas and body lice. Two key words, human fleas and body lice. Now, who or what group of people are known to have body and hair lice and have hair all over their bodies? Hirsute. Okay. The so-called Caucasian or wild man. They're the ones that spread diseases and pretty much wiped out the black nobility, so-called black inhabitants of Europe during those 13th, 14th century. The study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science uses records of its patterns and scale. The Black Death claimed an estimate 25 million lives, so-called black lives, more than a third of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351. So that's a part of the reason why we lost the rulership, the dwindling numbers, no antibodies, okay? And the people who know real history, or the higher ups, they know this. To the so-called regular average person, they don't know this. So picking back up at the article, has the black rat been falsely blamed for spreading plague during the Black Death? We have good mortality data from outbreaks in 9 cities in Europe, Professor Niles Stinseth from the University of Oslo told BBC News. So we could construct models of the disease dynamics there. He and his colleagues then simulated disease outbreaks in each of these cities, creating 3 models where the disease was spread by rats, airborne transmission, fleas, and lice that live on humans and their clothes. In 7 out of these 9 cities studied, the human parasite model was a much better match for the pattern of the outbreak. And there you go. The Black Plague was caused by the so-called Caucasian/Wildman. Now, I'm not saying all Caucasians are wild men. You did have the villains and the peasants and the ones that served on the land of the black nobility in Europe. Eventually, they came tired of the feudal system over there, and they pretty much, wars and got rid of the black nobility as well. So now I'm going to be reading from the book, The 13th Tribe by Arthur Koestler. And we're going to look at the information about the so-called wild man and the characteristics of certain tribes, the Khazars particularly. So now we're going to pick up at page 38. Although they lead a hard life, they behave like donkeys that have lost their way. They have no religion, which would link them to God. Key word, they have no religion, which would lead them to God. Nor are they guided by reason. They do not worship anything. Okay? The sexual morals of the Geese and other tribes were a remarkable mixture of liberalism and savagery. Let that sink in. Their women wear no veils in the presence of their men or strangers. Doesn't that sound like modern America right now, right? Nor do the women cover any parts of their bodies in the presence of people. We see that right now. Butt naked ass women walking down the streets. Nothing on. Babylon. One day we stayed at the place of a Geese and were sitting around. His wife was also present. As we conversed, the woman uncovered her private parts and scratched them, and we all saw it. Thereupon we covered our faces and said, "May God forgive me." The husband laughed and said to the interpreter, "Tell them we uncover it in your presence so that you may see and restrain yourselves, but it cannot be attained. This is better than when it is covered up and yet attainable. Adultery is alien to them. Yet when they discover that someone is an adulterer, they split them in 2 halves. This they do by bringing together the branches of the 2 trees, tie him to the branches, and then let both trees go, so that the man tied to them is torn in 2. Okay? As for homosexuality, which the Arab countries was taken as a matter of course, Ibn Fadlan says that it is regarded by the Turks as a terrible sin. But in the only episode he relates to prove his point, the seducer of a beardless youth gets away with a fine of 400 sheep. Accustomed to the splendid baths of Baghdad, our traveler could not get over the dirtiness of the Turks. The Geese do not wash themselves after defecating or urinating, nor do they bathe after seminal pollution or on the other occasions. They refuse to have anything to do with water, particularly in winter. When the Geese commander-in-chief took off his luxurious coat of brocade to don a new coat the mission had brought him, they saw that his underclothes were fraying apart from dirt, for it is their custom never to take off the garment they wear close to their bodies until it disintegrates. Another Turkish tribe, the Bashkirs, I'm pronouncing it right, shave their beards and eat their lice. Key word, shave their beards and eat their lice. And eat their lice. And eat their lice. So-called wild man. They search the folds of their undergarments and crack the lice with their teeth. When Ibn Fadlan watched a Bashkir do this, the latter remarked to him, They are delicious. Delicion. There you go. Okay. I mean, what more proof do you need? I mean, talk about hygiene, right? Apparently, these tribes didn't have any. A Georgian chronicle echoing an ancient tradition identifies them with the host of Gog and Magog. Wild man with hideous faces and manners of wild beast, eaters of blood. Wild man, keyword, with hideous faces and the manners of wild beast, eaters of blood.
About 90% of my diet is raw sheep meat. I'm just some buddy living in obscurity, eating my intestine smoothies in my kitchen. My name's Derek Nance. I'm from Lexington in the state of Kentucky. For the last 9 years, I've been sourcing and butchering and eating raw animals, and I've never felt healthier. This is a ram's testicle from a 3-year-old ram. It has a more salty taste. It's not like red meat, it's more of like a seafood almost. Growing up, I just had the standard American diet, had allergies and headaches and asthma and other signs of, food intolerance issues where I noticed certain foods were really giving me trouble. I'll chew a wad like rawhide, and I'll just chew it like gum throughout the day. I think it helps polish my teeth. Finally, I came across the Weston Price Foundation, and they do studies of indigenous diets. Eventually discovered the meat-based diet and just decided that, I'll give it a try. I was having so much trouble digesting everything else that meat seemed to work well for me, and I just felt like this was it. All right, so ready to prepare a stomach smoothie? You can smell it too. So here's the small intestine, the whole parts, different parts of the intestines. They all go into my smoothie. And I can eat this and be fine with it without any fear that the bacteria are going to come out to get me, because I actually think that they're beneficial. So I just make it into a smoothie, and it just makes it like all creamed together, and it's just much more consistent, easier, like a quick on-the-go snack. And my girlfriend made me designate a blender because I used to use her blender, and it holds that residual stomach smell. Save that for dessert. I believe that the nourishment that are in raw animal foods is far superior because there's certain nutrients that when undergoing the cooking process gets cooked out. I could sit here and chew on this bone for a good 15-20 minutes like a dog.